You wouldn't take this seriously, would you? She teased, her voice light, but with a tremor I couldn't miss. I looked at her over the rim of my coffee cup, noticing the slight crease between her eyebrows, the way her fingers traced invisible patterns on the tabletop. I already have, I replied simply, and the room seemed to pause for a moment, like we had stepped into a space that existed only for the two of us. We were at a mutual friend's small gathering, the kind that started with laughter and lukewarm wine and ended with people quietly checking their phones. She had a habit of using humor to mask what she didn't want to show, and I had learned to watch for it. Kate, bright, restless, carrying a kind of careful armor that didn't quite fit, was doing exactly that now. And yet, the way she studied me after my reply suggested she sensed I wasn't playing along with the joke. I wasn't. Not really. She leaned back in her chair, her hands finally still, and let out a breath that felt more like a confession than a laugh. That's unexpected, she said, tilting her head. People usually just shrug things off. I shrugged instead, but in a way that felt measured, intentional. It wasn't a challenge. It wasn't a tease. It was a statement of presence, calm, and awareness. I don't do shrugging, I said. For a few moments, the conversation around us continued as if nothing had happened. Plates clinked, voices rose and fell. A song hummed softly in the background. But between us, there was a thin thread, tense and quiet, almost fragile, that had been drawn taut by those 5 words I had offered. She noticed it, I knew, and she examined me with that cautious curiosity that made her eyes both wary and alive. Kate leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. So, what does that even mean? She asked, her tone still teasing, but less certain, as if the mask had slipped just a little. I smiled gently, not to disarm her, but to acknowledge the truth behind her question. It means I notice things, I said. It means I take things seriously when they matter, even when they seem small. Her lips curved in a half-smile, half-thoughtful frown. She nodded slowly, almost imperceptibly, and I caught the brief hesitation in her gaze, the subtle shift of her shoulders. I didn't rush her. I never did. Some people needed to arrive at understanding in their own time, and I had long learned that pushing only fractured what might form naturally. The rest of the evening passed in fragments, snippets of conversation, bursts of laughter, shared glances across the room, and yet, throughout all of it, there was a quiet awareness that had settled between us, like dust settling in sunlight after a storm. Nothing had changed in the world around us, but something had shifted in the air between Kate and me, something unspoken, tentative, but undeniable. As I left the gathering later that night, I thought of her, of the way she had let her mask drop for just a heartbeat, of the way that fleeting vulnerability had called out to me without words. I knew, without needing to say it aloud, that the thread between us had been drawn. Whether it would hold, or stretch, or unravel, I could not yet tell, but I had noticed. I had taken it seriously. And in that quiet attention, something like possibility had begun to take root. It was a few days later when I saw her again, completely by chance. I hadn't planned to, nor had I expected to, but life has a quiet way of arranging meetings when they matter most. I was at a small cafe tucked between 2 narrow streets downtown, the kind of place that smelled of roasted coffee beans and worn wood. I was sitting at my usual table by the window, watching the world blur past in soft motion, when she appeared, hesitating at the doorway like a figure paused between 2 worlds. Kate's eyes met mine almost immediately, and I noticed the same subtle tension that had lingered in our first meeting. Her movements were careful, precise, as though she feared disrupting something invisible but crucial. She carried a bag over her shoulder, and a faint tiredness in her posture. I gestured to the empty chair across from me, and she accepted without a word. "I didn't expect to see you here," she said, trying to sound casual, though her voice betrayed a faint relief. "I come here sometimes, when I need to think." Her fingers fiddled with the strap of her bag, and I realized she hadn't even sat down properly. She was hovering, caught between leaving and staying. "You're welcome to stay," I replied, calm as ever. I don't mind the company. That was true. I liked simply noticing her, without demanding anything in return. There was an ease in offering presence, a quiet reassurance that didn't require proof. She relaxed fractionally, sliding into the chair as if realizing she had permission to just be herself. We sat in silence for a while, watching the faint drizzle outside blur the edges of the streetlight. Sometimes silence says more than words. Sometimes it allows walls to shift and masks to fall gently aside. I could feel her noticing that, feeling it, though she didn't comment. "I had a rough day," she said finally, her voice low, almost vulnerable. "Not just today, actually. It's a lot sometimes." I nodded, neither pressing for details nor offering platitudes. I simply let her words exist in the space between us. "I hear you," I said softly, "and I'm here, if you want to share." That was all. No pressure, no expectation, just attention, presence, and steadiness. She exhaled slowly, a quiet sound that seemed to release some weight. It's strange. Some people see you, and some people just glance past. You notice. I notice, I confirmed, not needing to elaborate. That simple affirmation seemed to anchor her, and I watched the tension in her shoulders ease, imperceptibly, but undeniably. We stayed until the rain stopped, talking in small fragments. A half-finished book she was reading, a minor argument with a colleague, the way light refracted through wet glass. Nothing dramatic, nothing forced. Yet, in those fragments, a bridge began to form, unspoken but firm. When she finally stood to leave, she hesitated at the door, glancing back. I offered her a quiet smile, one that carried no insistence, only acknowledgement. She returned it, fleeting, but genuine, and then she was gone into the soft evening, leaving me with a sense of inevitability, a subtle understanding that something important had begun without a word needing to shout it. It started with a message. Not something urgent or demanding, just a casual note that carried more weight than she intended. "Could you help me with something at my place? Just for a bit?" It was short, almost apologetic, but it suggested an openness I hadn't yet seen fully. I replied simply, "I can be there in 20. The walk to her apartment was quiet, the city streets familiar and indifferent, but my mind was alert in a way that I rarely allowed. Small gestures, small openings, could reveal more than grand declarations ever could. When I arrived, she opened the door with a cautious smile, the kind that was almost shy, almost asking permission to exist beyond the threshold of her own defenses. Inside, the apartment smelled faintly of tea and lavender, the furniture neatly arranged, the kind of order that speaks of careful control. Kate led me to a shelf where a stack of boxes needed organizing, her movements precise but hesitant. I noticed the tension in her hands, the way she glanced at me occasionally, as if weighing whether my presence was safe or intrusive. "I don't usually ask for help," she admitted, her voice low. I just thought maybe," she trailed off, caught between vulnerability and pride. I nodded, understanding the unspoken weight behind the words. "You're allowed to ask for help. You're allowed to let someone in." I started moving the boxes, quiet and deliberate. She watched, and I could sense her mind running in circles, weighing the unfamiliar comfort of not being alone. When she finally joined, handing me one box after another, there was no rush, no tension of obligation. Our movements fell into a rhythm, synchronized not by instruction, but by presence. After a while, she paused, leaning against the doorway of the small kitchen. "I didn't realize, having someone here, it feels lighter," she said, almost as a question to herself. I didn't respond immediately, letting the moment settle. I simply looked at her and nodded, letting the silence say what words could not. "It's okay to feel lighter. It's okay to let it happen slowly." We continued, talking quietly about trivial things. Favorite books, the neighborhood cafe, the way rain sounded on the roof. But there was an underlying current, subtle and persistent, that threaded between the words. It was the recognition of trust forming, unhurried and unforced. The kind that doesn't announce itself but steadily builds with every shared task and every glance that lingers a beat too long. By the time I left, the evening had deepened into a soft, gray dusk. She walked me to the door, a little smile breaking through her habitual caution. "Thanks," she said simply. Nothing dramatic, nothing theatrical, but it was more than thanks. It was an acknowledgement, a small opening, an unspoken, "I see you, I notice you, you matter here." I left with the certainty that the thread between us had strengthened. It was fragile, yes, but it was there, tangible in a way that felt rare and vital. And for the first time, I sensed that she might allow herself to rely, even in the smallest ways, on someone who didn't demand, didn't rush, and simply chose to be present. The rain that afternoon was soft at first, a gentle tapping against the window, then gradually insistent, drumming on the roof like a reminder that the world moved on outside, regardless of our presence within. Kate had invited me over, almost casually, though I sensed the underlying tension. "It's nothing really, just wanted some company," she said, but her hands twisted nervously around the mug she carried. I arrived to find the apartment dimly lit, curtains drawn to soften the gray light from the storm. She moved with that cautious precision I had come to recognize, arranging a small tray with 2 cups of tea. When she offered one to me, her fingers brushed mine, fleetingly, and I noted the subtle shiver that followed, not from cold, but from the unexpected proximity of trust. We sat on the sofa, quiet at first, the only sound the steady rainfall against the glass. I watched her, noticing the faint shadows under her eyes, the slight slump in her shoulder, the way she seemed almost relieved to just be present with someone who wasn't asking for more than she could. "I don't usually let people see this," she admitted, voice low, almost confessional. "I'm supposed to be fine, Always fine. You don't have to be, I said gently, taking a sip from my cup. My tone carried no judgment, no lecture, just an acknowledgement of the truth in words. She looked at me, eyes searching, and I realized she was measuring my reaction, testing whether the calm I projected was real or performative. It was real, always real. She spoke then, in fragments, of her fears, her past disappointments, the pressure to appear strong, the silent weight of solitude. I listened, letting the words flow without interruption, without the need to offer solution. Sometimes listening is enough. Sometimes simply being there, unshaken and present, communicates more than any advice or gesture. At one point, she set her cup down, her hands clasped in her lap, and looked at me. Why do you just stay? Most people leave or try to fix things I'm not ready to fix. I met her gaze calmly. Because being here matters more than fixing, I said, and because noticing isn't the same as judging. She smiled faintly, a mixture of relief and incredulity. The tension in her shoulders eased, and for the first time that evening, she leaned back fully, allowing herself to settle into the space, into the presence that wasn't Our conversation ebbed and flowed, punctuated by long silences, quiet laughter, and the occasional glance out at the rain-soaked street. Time passed unnoticed, the storm outside fading into a drizzle, but inside, a subtle shift had occurred. Kate's guarded edges softened slightly, and I could feel the small, fragile beginnings of trust weaving between us. When I finally left, she walked me to the door, the faintest trace of a smile lingering, an acknowledgement of the quiet connection that had grown in those hours. Kate's phone buzzed with a message that made her pause, her fingers hovering above the screen like she was weighing an impossible decision. She looked at me, eyes slightly wide, a mixture of hope and apprehension. I might have to move, she admitted softly, as if speaking the words aloud made them heavier. I nodded, steady, letting the silence stretch before I spoke. Do you want to go? My voice was calm, firm, but without pressure. I didn't ask for her to consider me. I didn't ask for her to stay. I asked because I knew the question mattered more than the answer. Her brow furrowed, and she laughed softly, more out of nervousness than humor. I don't know. It's complicated. Family, work. Everything feels like it's pushing me in that direction. She looked down at her hands, twisting a ring that didn't carry significance but had become a nervous anchor. I understand, I said, taking a slow breath. But this isn't about what others expect. It's about what you want. That's what matters. My words weren't meant to guide her or to persuade, only to remind her that choice was hers. And the weight of that reminder seemed to settle on her shoulders like something tangible, something she had almost forgotten she could hold. She exhaled, almost as if deciding something invisible. I've spent so much of my life just moving where I'm pushed, she admitted. Her eyes met, vulnerability raw and sudden. I don't want to keep doing that. You don't have to, I said softly. Not anymore. You can choose. And even if it's hard, even if it's uncertain, that choice is yours. For a moment, she was silent, the kind of quiet that carries more than words ever could. Then she laughed lightly, shaking her head as if releasing some tension she hadn't realized she was holding. You make it sound almost simple, she said. It doesn't have to be simple, I replied. It just has to be yours. That's enough. She leaned back in her chair, hands resting in her lap, eyes distant but reflective. I watched her for a moment, not pressing, just present. Presence is often stronger than advice. Presence is the quiet assurance that someone will not abandon you while you figure out your own path. And I knew, in that stillness, that she was beginning to feel it, the first real sense of safety that didn't come with strings or expectation. When she finally smiled, it was small, but real, like sunlight filtering through clouds after days of rain. Maybe I don't need to run, she murmured. Maybe you don't, I agreed. The power went out without warning, plunging the apartment into darkness punctuated only by flashes of lightning from the storm outside. Kate's voice was barely audible when she called me. Oliver, could you come? There was no hesitation in her words, only a quiet urgency that pulled at something steady inside me. I didn't pause. I grabbed my coat and left. The streets were slick with rain, the wind tugging at my jacket, but the thought of her alone in that darkness kept my pace brisk and sure. When I arrived, the faint glow of candles flickered in the apartment, casting elongated shadows across the walls. She opened the door before I could knock, drenched and shivering, the storm reflected in her wide eyes. It's worse than I thought, she admitted, stepping back to let me in. Her voice was small, vulnerable in a way I hadn't fully seen before. I closed the door behind me, letting the warmth of my presence counter the chill of her fear. There was no dramatic gesture, no grand declaration, just steady, quiet support. We moved to the living room, where she had gathered a few candles on the low table. The flickering light caught her hair and softened the tension etched into her face. I helped her arrange a blanket over the sofa, and without a word, she sank into it. I sat beside her, close enough to offer comfort without imposing, letting the silence speak volume. Hours passed with the storm's rhythm as our backdrop. We spoke in whispers, fragments of conversation spilling over about insignificant things, the way rain changes the smell of the city, the sound of traffic over wet streets. But beneath those words, there was a deeper exchange. It was the unspoken acknowledgement that she wasn't alone, that the storm outside wasn't a metaphor she had to face by herself. She eventually leaned back, eyes closing briefly, trusting the quiet in the... I draped the blanket over her shoulders, careful and deliberate, making sure she was warm without needing her to ask. When she dozed off, resting her head lightly against the arm of the sofa, I stayed seated, watching the shadows dance across the walls, keeping guard in the only way I knew: presence. Morning came slowly. The storm had passed, leaving the city wet and gleaming in pale sunlight. She woke gradually, the first thing she saw being me still there, calm, steady, unchanged. She didn't need to speak. Her small, genuine smile said enough. The night had been endured, shared, and survived together. Something between us had shifted quietly, imperceptibly, but irrevocably. The morning after the storm, the city felt unusually quiet, as if it had paused to recover from the night's chaos. I thought about Kate, wondering if she would retreat behind her usual walls now that the intensity of the night had passed. And as if answering my unspoken question, I noticed a message on my phone. "Thanks again for last night. I'm okay." I didn't respond immediately. Some moments, some exchanges, need space to breathe. I waited, letting her words settle, letting her presence remain intact without intrusion. Hours later, I sent a simple reply: "I'm here if you want." She didn't respond right away. That pause was telling, but I didn't press. Some people need silence as much as they need words, and I understood that presence is often more powerful than insistence. She chose to reach out again when she was ready, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. That distinction mattered. Later that afternoon, I went about my routine, feeling her absence as a quiet echo rather than a burden. When she finally texted back, it was brief. "Can I come by later? Just to talk." The simplicity of it was profound. She wasn't asking for solution, nor for assurance. She was asking for presence, and that was enough. When she arrived, she seemed smaller somehow, tentative, like someone who had weathered something significant and emerged cautious. I welcomed her without comment, letting her find the space she needed. She didn't speak immediately, just sat with her hands folded, eyes shifting around the room as if testing the world. I didn't rush her, didn't fill the silence with unnecessary words. Eventually, she sighed softly, the sound carrying a subtle weight of relief. "It's strange," she murmured, "how things feel lighter after a night like that, but also complicated. I keep thinking I should be stronger." "You don't have to be strong all the time," I said quietly. "Strength isn't just about endurance. Sometimes it's in letting someone sit with you while the world waits." My words hung between us, steady and unforced. She studied me, considering them, letting the idea sink in slowly. We talked in fragments then, about trivialities first, the way conversations often start when something heavier lingers underneath. Yet each word, each pause, carried the weight of trust forming. She was beginning to see that choosing to stay, even momentarily, didn't demand compromise or weakness. It simply meant allowing herself to exist in a shared space without fear. By the time she left, the light had shifted, softening the room's edges. She didn't hug or linger theatrically. She simply looked at me, eyes quieter than before, and smiled, a small acknowledgement that she had felt seen, that she had felt safe, if only for a while. I knew, in that subtle exchange, that the bridge between us had strengthened, quietly, imperceptibly, yet firmly enough to endure the pauses that would inevitably come. The afternoon had settled into the kind of quiet that feels almost deliberate, like the city was holding its breath. I was at work, reviewing notes for a project, when I noticed movement at the window. Kate stood there, framed by the soft light, holding a book I had lent her weeks ago. She waved briefly, uncertain, almost apologetic, and then disappeared from sight. A moment later, she appeared in the doorway, carrying the book as though it were a token of some unspoken significance. She didn't speak at first, just set it on the edge of my desk, the cover catching the light. I looked up and offered a small smile. "I didn't expect to see you here. I wanted to return this," she said softly, voice low, almost cautious. But then, inexplicably, she lingered, not out of obligation, not out of ceremony, but simply out of the desire to be present. I gestured to the chair across from me, and she accepted, settling into it like someone testing the stability of the air between us. The conversation began as a trickle, mundane and light, comments about the weather, the small frustrations of commuting, the oddities of our colleague. But beneath it, There was a tension that neither of us pushed to define, a quiet awareness of proximity and presence. Her fingers traced the edge of the book absent-mindedly, and I noticed the subtle way her gaze returned to mine, seeking a reassurance I hadn't yet offered and didn't need to force. After a while, she spoke, quietly, almost as if testing the words before letting them out. "It's strange," she said, her tone hesitant. "Being here, like this. I don't usually—" She stopped, searching for the right phrasing. I simply nodded, waiting, letting the space stretch around us. "I don't usually feel like I can just stay." "You can," I said plainly. No emphasis, no rush, no expectation, just the truth, quietly offered. And in that moment, something shifted subtly. She exhaled, a soft sound that seemed to release a tension I hadn't noticed she'd been carrying. We spoke little after that, letting silences fill the gaps between words. It was not awkward. It was deliberate, reflective, a language we were beginning to share. Every glance, every pause, every faint smile built upon what had come before. Trust, attention, the quiet permission to simply exist alongside another person. When she finally rose to leave, she lingered at the door, eyes meeting mine with a weightless certainty. No dramatic gesture, no exaggerated farewell, just a recognition, small and precise, that she had been seen and that she had chosen to stay, if only for a moment. I watched her leave, and for the first time in days, I felt the inevitability of something quietly profound beginning between us. We found ourselves on the curb outside a small food truck, the air cool and still, carrying the scent of freshly fried dough and lingering coffee. Kate leaned against the edge of the cart, hands tucked into her coat pockets, and I stood beside her, the world around us blurred by the hum of distant traffic and the occasional murmur of passers-by. There was no urgency in our stance, no expectation beyond simply being there. "It feels weird," she began, voice low, tentative. "Everything with you. It's not like anything I expected." "Why is that?" I looked at her, calm, steady, and for a moment, I let silence do the work. "Sometimes, the question needs to float before an answer anchors it. I suppose it's because we don't force it," said finally. "Because we don't try to be more than what we are in the moment. You're not pretending, and neither am I. That alone changes the pace." She studied me then, eyes flicking from my face to the streetlights reflecting on wet pavement, trying to read meaning in my quiet assurance. She shifted, curling one arm around her torso. "I'm used to people trying to change me, or tell me what I should feel. With you, it's different. Safe, maybe, but also strange." "Different doesn't have to be frightening," I said. "Safe doesn't mean dull. It just means that you get to choose what you let in and what you don't." The words weren't rehearsed, though I had thought them over countless times in the quiet of my own mind. They were offered gently, as if leaving her the space to catch them at her own pace. A pause stretched between us. She breathed slowly, the faint exhale a signal of trust, of easing tension. "I think I'm starting to understand," she admitted, almost to herself. "I've spent so much time worrying about whether I'm too much or not enough, and with you, it doesn't feel like that matters." I nodded. "It doesn't matter. What matters is you being present, here and now. That's enough." Her gaze lingered, a quiet contemplation settling over her features, the kind that comes from realizing the weight of something unspoken. I could feel the bridge we were crossing, built not from grand gestures but from presence, respect, and small acknowledgments of shared space. She reached out briefly, brushing her fingers against mine, not asking, not demanding, merely testing connection. I responded by closing my hand lightly, steady. It was an act without fanfare, but it carried all the gravity of the moment. We stayed there, side by side, silent and deliberate, letting the night, the food truck's faint aroma, and the small friction of touch create a private rhythm. And in that quiet exchange, we both understood something profound, that beginnings don't always announce themselves with fireworks. Sometimes, they arrive softly, unmistakably, in the spaces between words, and in the courage to simply be together. We walked along the quiet street, the city bathed in the soft glow of streetlights, the hum of distant traffic, a gentle undertone to our silence. Kate's coat brushed against mine, unplanned, but somehow natural. She didn't speak, and I didn't rush her. Sometimes, the rhythm of two people walking together says more than words ever could. "You know," she said finally, almost in a whisper, "I never thought I'd let someone in like this." Her eyes traced the lights above us, then flicked briefly to mine. "Not like this. Not," calmly. I didn't answer immediately. I let her statement linger, honoring its weight. "You can," I said at last, quietly, with the kind of certainty that isn't demanding, isn't pressing. "It's your choice, and I won't step away unless you ask me to." She smiled, small and cautious, as if testing whether she was allowed to feel it fully. "It's strange," All my life I thought it had to be loud to matter, but now, walking here, talking like this, it feels enough. It doesn't need to be anything else, I replied. Being noticed doesn't require spectacle. Being chosen doesn't need justification. Sometimes, it's enough to just be. We walked a little further, side by side, letting the silence settle between us comfortably. There was no urgency, no expectation of what would come next. Just the slow, deliberate acknowledgement of presence and the quiet promise of continuity. I could feel her shoulders, the tension that had been coiled in her posture softening as she allowed herself to exist without pretense. You really notice me, she murmured, almost to herself, but loud enough that I heard it. I do, I said simply, and it wasn't a statement of possessiveness or declaration. It was a promise, steady and unwavering, the kind that doesn't demand a return but asks only to be accepted. The rest of the walk passed in quiet observation, the way the streetlights reflected in puddles, the distant echo of a train, the occasional laughter from a nearby cafe. Each sound, each sight, seemed to deepen the rhythm we had established, gentle, unforced, deliberate. When we reached the corner where our paths would diverge, she paused, not for drama, not for theatrics, but as if acknowledging a new understanding. Her hand brushed lightly against mine, a fleeting contact that carried more than words. I squeezed it gently, a silent confirmation. I had noticed, I had chosen, and I would continue to be present. As she turned to leave, I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of everything unspoken between us. And in that quiet, unassuming exchange, I realized that some beginnings don't announce themselves with grandeur. They simply arrive, steady and certain, carried in the small, deliberate acts that matter most.